Welcome to the Living Well Church podcast, and thanks for tuning in today. Our mission as a church is to help people find faith in Jesus and a life of purpose and hope. You're about to watch a message that will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you, and most of all, point you to Jesus and the life of purpose and hope He has planned for you. So lean in and enjoy, and let God speak into your life.
It's my turn to tell you a little bit about my testimony and to answer the question, how do I know that my God is awesome? And I've actually found it really difficult to prepare for this morning. And I think the other preachers have as well when they had their turns. And normally when I'm struggling to prepare for a sermon, it's because I'm struggling for inspiration on a subject. You know, I'm struggling to sort of generate enough content around a particular passage or a particular theme. And that is not the case this morning. It's actually the complete opposite today. It's that there's just so much I could say to answer that question. I could go in so many different directions with this because God has been so good in my life. And you know, I could tell you about His amazing healing power. You know, I could tell you about how a few years ago He healed my brother Ashley from deafness in one of his ears. I could talk to you about His amazing protection and provision. And I could tell you how He saved me and 3 of my family members from a potentially fatal car crash about 3 years ago. Or I could talk to you about the journey that this church has been on in the last 26 years or so since I've been a part of it. And some of the amazing things He's done here for us as an assembly. Or I could talk to you about some of the many stories that my grandparents have told me over the years about how God protected them during the war in miraculous ways that actually mean I'm even stood here this morning. But actually, there's just too much. There's too much to go through in 25 or 30 minutes. So I've really had to think about what it is that stands out the most. What it is that really amazes me the most about what God has done so far in my life. And I don't know about you, but the things that I find most awesome in other people, the qualities I admire most in other people are generally the qualities that I don't have. They're the things that I struggle with the most. So for example, I have a terrible memory, a really bad memory, the memory of an 80-year-old, not a 26-year-old. And there are some guys at my office who have an incredible ability to retain information. Whether that's dates, companies, people, events, they just seem to be able to store all this data in their brain. My boss, he's been running his own business for about 15, 20 years now, and he could pretty much tell you every single person that he's ever met in that 15 to 20 year period, even down to the most ridiculous level of detail, like, what their dogs' names are, where they went to school, and things like that. And to me, that's just amazing, because I can barely remember what day of the week it is most of the time. So I really admire that in people. Another thing I lack is patience. In fact, I'd probably go as far as to say that I am the least patient person I know. I don't think that would be an exaggeration. Apparently, the average person, when trying to load up a web page on their mobile phone, will wait about 10 seconds of buffering before they give up on that action. I think for me, it's genuinely more like 2 or 3 seconds. If it's not working immediately, I've had enough. I can't be bothered anymore. And if I go into a shop and the attendant in the shop doesn't even look up and acknowledge my presence in the first 5 seconds or so, that drives me mad. And even worse than that is when I'm trying to have a conversation with my mother. And I know for a fact she isn't listening to what I'm saying, and I've had to repeat myself for the 3rd time to get my message across, and that drives me potty. So actually, when I meet people that show patience, and that seem to be able to demonstrate patience as a really natural quality, to me that is incredible. And actually, over the years, when I look back, I think that the thing that amazes me most about God is how patient He is, how patient He's been with me. Because actually, I had probably the best upbringing I could possibly have ever asked for in terms of Christianity. I was born into a loving Christian family. I've got really great role models as parents who've always had a really solid faith. I've always had a good group of Christian friends around me. I've always been part of a brilliant church that has committed to nurturing me spiritually from a very young age, actually. In my fairly immediate family alone, I've got a grandfather who was a pastor. I've got a father who is a pastor, and I've got 4 uncles that are pastors. And whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, It's completely down to interpretation. But what could never be said about me is that I've lacked strong Christian role models in my life. So actually, God gave me the best foundation possible to live a really pure and a really holy life from a young age, and a life that would have, fulfilled his desires for me. And yet, in spite of that, in spite of a foundation that's so much stronger than 99% of people get, I've failed God more times than I could possibly imagine. And I've let him down in ways that would probably shock and appall some of you. Some of the conversations that I've been in over the years, some of the environments I've found myself in would probably shock you based on that. And what I want to do this morning is I want to acknowledge how patient God is. I want to thank him for his patience. Because, to me, the fact that even after all of those failings, that he still is committed to me, that his faithfulness and his desires for me are still as strong as they've ever been, to me that is so awesome. And I want to spend a bit of time this morning looking at a guy in the Bible that I feel I have a lot of affinity with and I can relate to. And when I read through this book of the Bible, I see myself in it in so many ways. And this is a guy called Jonah. So if you want to turn with me, if you've got Bibles, we're going to look at the book of Jonah, which is in the Old Testament, between the books of Obadiah and Micah. And we're just going to read chapter 1 and verses 1 to 12. And it's entitled, Jonah Flees from the Lord. And my iPad is frozen. Here we go. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down, and he fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us who is responsible for making all of this trouble for us. What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and dry land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he'd already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it's my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Now there are a few things that I relate to in Jonah as a man and the journey that he goes on. 3 things in particular. The first is he's an idiot. Secondly, he's an idiot that should know better. And thirdly, it's only when God gives him a massive kick up the backside that he actually gets himself into gear. And I see so much of myself in those 3 things. And the important thing to note about Jonah is that he was a prophet. And the word prophet comes from the Greek word prophetes, which literally means to speak forth or to advocate, which means to speak on behalf of somebody. So what we know about Jonah is that he has a relationship with God that is so good that actually he speaks forth the word of God to his people. And we read about Jonah doing this for the first time 20 Old Testament books earlier in 2 Kings. So we can probably assume that he's a fairly established prophet as well. And yet despite that clearly very close relationship, that intimate relationship with God, we read in this book about how Jonah makes a total hash of this situation. Because God commands him to go to Nineveh. And Nineveh is a city that would be found in modern-day Iraq today. And it was a place that at the time was occupied by the Assyrians. And the Assyrians were known for not being particularly pleasant people. They were idolatrous, they were adulterous, they were ruthless, and they were hell-bent on world domination, basically. So there might have been a little bit of Jonah that was afraid to go and preach to them, which you could probably forgive. if there was a bit of fear in there. But actually what we find out at the end of this book is that the main reason Jonah doesn't want to go to Nineveh isn't because of fear. It's actually because he doesn't think that the Assyrians deserve God's forgiveness. So he doesn't want to go and bring them to a place where they say sorry and they repent of what they're doing. So actually, because he doesn't really fancy what God has asked him to do in this situation, he flees from God. And we're told that he actually goes to Tarshish, which is 2,500 miles across the sea in the opposite direction of Nineveh. It was actually probably the most remote place that he could have headed for. Yeah, was it within his reach with the kind of channels that he could have gone on the boat? So he was basically trying to put as much distance between himself and Nineveh as physically possible. So as much distance between him and what God's calling him to do as possible. But also he's trying to actually put space between him and God as well. But that seems so stupid, doesn't it? Like, how can somebody who knows God this well, who has such an intimate relationship with God that he gets to speak forth the very word of God to his people, how can somebody that knows God that well think that A, he could hide or run from God anyway, and B, that actually if he went completely against what God was calling him to, that there wouldn't be any negative repercussions for him? It seems crazy. But actually, when I look back on my life so far, I find myself asking that very same question sometimes. How could I possibly have been so stupid? And I think back to my school years in particular, my secondary school years, and the thing that frustrates me most when I look back at my secondary school years was that this was also the time in my life where I was really starting to appreciate who God was. My relationship with God was starting to develop to a significant point. But I think I in school was probably guilty of a mindset that a number of people fall into in school. And I really saw school as a bubble. And I saw it as a bubble for a very kind of set period of time. So I knew I was only going to be there for 5 to 7 years. And I thought at the time the most important thing was to have fun at school. And maybe that is true to a degree. But actually, I lost sight of who I really was when I was in secondary school. And maybe some of you here today that are in university or in school will relate to this, but I was not the same person in school that I was in church on a Sunday. In fact, I was probably unrecognizable in some ways. I wasn't the worst behaved kid in the world, but I definitely wasn't the best. And I had the potential to be rude and to be disrespectful and to be crude. And the conversations that I was involved in on a day-to-day basis weren't good. They were derogatory. I was using bad language. I was watching things I shouldn't have been watching on my friends' phones and things like that, and I just blended into that crowd at school, basically. And the worst thing about it was actually that I also encouraged this behavior in my non-Christian friends, much more than I discouraged it. And I had quite a lot of friends at school. I was a relatively popular kid because I was quite good at sport, and when you go to an all-boys school, actually being good at sport is definitely a good way to make friends. But they were the priorities for me at school. It was actually, I wanted to be popular, I wanted to have friends, I wanted to be seen as a fun guy to be around, and I wanted to excel at my sport. And they were the things that I prioritized in school. And you know what, I actually achieved those things pretty well. I had a good group of friends, I was seen as a fun person to be around. From a sporting perspective, I represented my house, my school in pretty much every sport going. Apart from cricket, because let's be honest, apart from Jack, no one really likes to play cricket. It's the world's most boring game. But certainly, football, rugby, basketball, athletics, I won countless trophies. Twice during my time at school, I was even acknowledged as the most outstanding sportsman in the year, on 2 occasions. And on top of that, I actually did pretty well in my exams as well. And Amy will tell you how much revision I put in. And yet I still did okay in my exams and came out with pretty good GCSEs and pretty good A-levels. So you could look at my time at school and go, actually, that was quite successful. I had friends, I excelled at my sport, I did well academically as well. And even though the teachers probably didn't want to like me most of the time because I was a pain in the backside, they did like me. But actually, when I look back on my school years, there's some of my biggest regrets happened during that period. And when I look back now, I see that as a massively wasted opportunity. And the worst part of it is I knew what God was calling me to. So I couldn't claim naivety. That was a point where I was starting to develop my relationship with God, and I knew what he was calling me to. And I knew that he was calling me to be salt and light in my school. and he was calling me to be an example and a witness in my school. And I failed massively in that. And that was a time in my life where I had the most non-Christian friends that I've ever had in my life, and deep, meaningful relationships with non-Christians as well. You know, I was engaging with 20, 30, 40 non-Christian lads every day in a really meaningful way, and I was being a terrible example, basically. And I didn't bring a single one of them to know Jesus during that time. And when I look back, that is a huge regret of mine. You know, I brought some of them along to youth club, I did things like that, but it would have made no difference because of the way I behaved in school. I was prioritizing all of the wrong things during that period in my life. And now today I have a group of non-Christian friends that's only a fraction of the size. You know, my sphere of influence now is tiny compared to what it was at that point. The one thing that I didn't ever do was I never denied that I knew Jesus. So I was honest about that, and you know, all of my friends knew that I went to church on a Sunday. They knew that it stopped me from doing certain things, and you know, they'd harmlessly make fun of me for it, which was fine. So I still had this identity as a Christian in school. And you might say, well, that's a good thing, Joe. You know, you never denied that you knew Jesus. You know, you were a witness in that sense, that you weren't embarrassed to admit that was something you did. Because actually, for a kid in an all-boys school, it's not an easy thing to talk about. When you think about the context of what most teenage boys' conversations are and that sort of stuff, it's not easy to say that you're a Christian, but I did. But actually, looking back now, I'm not even sure that was a good thing that I said that. Because actually saying you're a Christian's really easy, I think. You know, it might be tough in that school environment, but generally in life, it's not difficult to say you're a Christian, because I know a lot of people that would say they're Christians, but probably aren't. The hard bit is living like a Christian. Something that I definitely wasn't doing in my school years. There's a pretty famous passage in the Bible in Matthew 26 where Peter denies that he knows Jesus 3 times. I'm just going to read it to you. It says, "Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. 'You also were with Jesus of Galilee,' she said. But he denied it before them all. 'I don't know what you're talking about,' he said. Then he went out to the gateway where another servant girl saw him, and said to the people there, 'This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth.' He denied it again with an oath. 'I don't know the man.' After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, 'Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away.' Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, 'I do not know the man.' Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word that Jesus had spoken, 'Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times.' And he went outside, and he wept bitterly." And you could read that, and you could be quite judgmental of Peter. And you could say, "Come on, Peter, how could you possibly have denied Jesus in that way? You know, you were one of his closest friends, arguably his closest friend. You would have seen firsthand all of the amazing things that he did when he walked on this earth. How could you possibly have abandoned him in his hour of need like that?" But actually, let me ask you this. What's worse? Is it worse to live out a life that actually is representative of the relationship you have with Jesus, but sometimes be afraid to admit it? Or is it worse to boldly claim that you do follow Jesus, but to live a life that totally and utterly contradicts it? Because that's what I did at school. And actually, when I left school, it didn't completely stop either. You know, I transitioned into working life, I moved to London, and I found other ways to achieve the same result for a number of years. You know, there's a big drinking culture in London. And it's a really difficult thing to avoid, because if you want to socialise with anybody, it's normally at the pub or it's in a bar. And, you know, in my first few years in London, I fell in with a bit of the wrong crowd, to be honest. I was really struggling to get integrated into a church, and I didn't have many Christian friends in London. So I would spend a lot of time with colleagues and with non-Christian friends. And I would spend far too much time having too much to drink in bars and in pubs. And I'm sure I'm not on my own here, but the more that I drink, the less like Jesus I become. You know, the looser my tongue gets, the less empathy I have for people. You know, the less I take into account other people's feelings. The more obnoxious I become, if you can imagine how possible that is. So you can only imagine how well I represented Jesus on some of these nights out in London. And all this time I knew better. This is the common theme through my testimony. All the time I knew better. I knew what I should have been doing. I knew what God was calling me to. But because I didn't like it, I was running away, just like Jonah, stupidly running away from God. I just want to look at the next part of Jonah's story very quickly, going back to Jonah 1 and picking up in verse 17. And this is after they've thrown Jonah into the ocean. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, "In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled around me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again towards your holy temple." And when I was reading this recently, I really began to think, how would Jonah have felt when he was inside that fish? Just from a very obvious point of view, it must have been disgusting in there. I walk past a fishmonger and start to heave because I can't deal with that smell. So imagine being in a fish. It must have been gross in there, and it must have been dark, it must have been lonely. All the very physical, practical things must have been awful. But you know what I think was probably even worse than that? It was the knowledge that Jonah had put himself there through his disobedience. Because he hadn't followed God, because he hadn't obeyed what God was calling him to, he'd actually put himself in that fish. And actually, Jonah's Israelite heritage was completely the opposite of that. And his history would have been good about, the times when God instructed his Israelite ancestors to do things. And when they obeyed God, they were successful. How did Moses lead the Israelites out of Egypt? How did he part the Red Sea? How did Joshua bring the walls of Jericho down? How did David win countless battles against the odds? It was all down to obedience. And he would have known that if he had been obedient, he wouldn't have been inside the fish. So that must have been a pretty awful place to be, both physically and spiritually for Jonah in that time. And in fact, I know that that's a pretty awful place to be, because I've spent far too much of my time over the years metaphorically in the belly of the fish. There was one night in particular a few years back when I felt exactly like this. And I'd been on a company quarterly do to a restaurant in London. And our work events can involve quite a lot of alcohol. And there was one partner in particular who has he's got a bit of a reputation for being volatile after a few drinks. And on this night, he seemed to have it out for me. He seemed to be gunning for me for some reason. And I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues, and he was starting to shout things down the table at me, like trying to antagonize me a little bit. And I just ignored him for half an hour to an hour, but he just kept on going, and he kept on going, and he kept on going. So I think in the end, I just told him to shut up. I just carried on with my dinner, and he seemed to quieten down, and I thought that was the end of it, to be honest. About half an hour later, we left this restaurant, and we went heading to another bar. And as we were, this guy came out of nowhere. He came up to me, and he pushed the chest quite hard. Kind of in a key way, but you could tell there was definitely some feeling behind it. And he swore at me, and then he turned to go away. And at that point, I had a decision to make. And my decision was, am I going to be the bigger man here? Am I going to be the Christian here and do the right thing? Or am I going to lose my head? And I definitely made the wrong decision. And I pushed him back. And I didn't push him with all of my strength, but I'm bigger than him, and I'm stronger than him. And I pushed him, and he went flying. And he ended up on his backside, which for a millisecond was really funny. But it very quickly went from being really funny to being quite a serious situation, because he was embarrassed, and he got up, and he was furious. And next thing, he was in my face, and he was trying to throw punches at me, and it was just a mess, basically. And I held him at arm's length, and eventually a couple of the other guys came, they grabbed him, and they pulled him off, and that was kind of the end of it. But the next morning in the office, obviously everybody was talking about this. And he did apologize the next day, and he did accept that he was probably in the wrong, and everyone that had seen it said it wasn't your fault, etc. But that didn't do anything for me. To me, I was utterly embarrassed and utterly ashamed that the real conversation was the fight that I'd had with one of our partners on the company do the night before. I was properly in the metaphorical belly of the fish in that time. I was so disappointed with myself. I was so upset that the Christian in the office had been involved with something like this. Because again, everyone at work knows that I'm a Christian. They all know that it's a massive part of my life. But in that moment, I'd lost my cool. And whether it was, my pride, whether it was alcohol, whatever, it's probably a combination of all of those things, to be honest. But I'd lost my mind, and I'd lost the intention that I would normally have had in that situation. And I wasn't where God was calling me to be. Because if I had been in a place where God was calling me to be, I would not have reacted like that. So I was in the belly of the fish, so disappointed with myself, knowing that I had put myself there. Knowing that actually if I'd obeyed God, if I was following the life that God had called me to properly, that situation wouldn't have happened. And the truth is, I could tell you many stories like that. For a long time, it was like I just never learnt my lesson. I never, ever figured it out. There were nights when I had so much to drink that I couldn't even remember where I'd been when I woke up the following morning. Just time and time again, stupid things, stupid mistakes, and all coming from not being aligned with where God wanted me. And you know what? If somebody had let me down as many times as I've let God down over the years, I wouldn't want to know that person anymore. I wouldn't want anything to do with that person anymore. And if I was God, I would have given up on Joe Abbott many, many years back, especially considering that great foundation that he gave me. In Matthew 18, verses 21 to 22, Peter asks Jesus a question. And he says, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? And Jesus responds, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times." And in many ancient cultures, Hebrew included, the number 7 was seen as perfection. It was seen as completion. And there was also this idea in Jewish society that you should forgive somebody else 3 times, but never the 4th. That was the cultural idea. So actually, when Peter says, up to 7 times, he's probably thinking 7 is the perfect number. 7 is the complete number. And it's also more than twice what the Jewish custom would have been for forgiveness. So he probably thinks Jesus would be impressed with that number. And yet Jesus says, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. And what he means by that is you take your idea of good, take your idea of generous, take your idea of forgiveness and multiply it by itself time and time and time again, and then maybe you'll get close to where I'm at. Maybe you'll get close to where my heart is. He's saying there should be no end to our forgiveness for each other because there is no end to his forgiveness for us. There's no end to his patience for us. And the amount of times that God has had to forgive me over the years is probably more like 770,777. And to me, the fact that despite all of that, he still cares. And not only does he still care about me, but actually he still wants to use me. That to me is awesome. That's the definition of awesomeness to me. And sometimes I worry. I feel a bit like we as a preaching team can come across like we know everything. Like we've got it all sorted in our lives, and actually we're far more accomplished in the things that we preach about on a Sunday. But I want you to know that isn't the case, and I'm sure that all of the other preachers would agree with me that when we do speak on a Sunday, we speak to each other and we speak to ourselves just as much as we speak to any of you. And I hope from what I've said this morning, it's really clear just how flawed I am. And the truth is I could stand here all day and tell you stories about how I've messed up over the years. And maybe you're here today and you can relate to what I've said. Maybe you feel like actually you've let God down so many times. That you've let him down far too many times to deserve his love. Like the prodigal son who took his inheritance and just wasted it on the wrong things. Because that's what I did. I took this incredible inheritance, this incredible foundation, and just focused on the wrong things for so many years. And wasted years that God could have been doing amazing things. And maybe like me, you've spent a lot of time metaphorically in the belly of the fish. In that deep cycle of regret and of failure. For a long time I felt like a fraud, really. Because I felt like on a Sunday people were seeing one version of me, and in the week there was a completely different side to me. And people would tell me that I was a great role model and I was this and I was that, and I would think in my heart, that's not who I am outside of this church. And that was really, really hard. But actually, I had to come to a place where I got so fed up of that feeling of letting God down. I got so fed up of that feeling of being metaphorically in the fish, knowing that actually if I behaved differently, if I followed what God was calling me to, my life would look so different. So I had to come to a place where I was brutally honest with myself, because we're so good at making excuses for ourselves, aren't we? And for me, for a long time, it was, you know what, I'm still young. One day I'm going to have to settle down. One day I won't have the freedom to do these kind of things. And that was one of the excuses I used a lot. As well as, I don't want to be a boring Christian. I want to be someone that people can relate to. I want to be someone that, can have fun and all this kind. So I just found all of these different ways to justify the way that I was behaving. But I had to come to a place where I was just really, really honest with myself and really real with myself. And God doesn't want us to be boring Christians. That's not his desire for us. In the Psalms alone, there's verse after verse that talks about how his desire for us is to be joyful and to laugh and to, be happy. But things that compromise our integrity and things that compromise our relationship with God are not things that will bring us joy. So I just really felt on my heart that there would be people here today that this would resonate with. And maybe for some of you, it is alcohol. Maybe like me, you know that you've spent too long, in pubs and in bars, having drunk too much, becoming less and less like Jesus as the drinks go. But maybe it's completely different for you. Maybe it's relationships, maybe it's sex, maybe it's computer games, I don't know. But things that are more of a priority in the way that you live your life at the moment. Things that mean that you're not truly following the life that God is calling you to at this point. So I don't want to tell you how to respond this morning, because maybe you just need to sit here for a few minutes and do some business with God. And Phil's going to come and he's going to play quietly in the background. And maybe you just want to spend some time with God this morning, figuring some of this stuff out, realigning where he is in your life so that he's right at the center. Or maybe you want to pray with somebody. And, sometimes it's really good to be accountable with someone when you're struggling with something, when you find something hard, when you've messed up. From my experience, when you're accountable to somebody, that's when things start to change. That's when it becomes real. And there's no embarrassment in this. It takes courage and it takes bravery to admit that you're struggling with something and that you want to correct that. And there's no shame in it. I've stood here for half an hour this morning and I've told you some of the things that I'm most ashamed about in my past. So I'm definitely not going to judge you if you need prayer this morning. Nobody else is going to judge you here. But if you want to do that, if you want to pray with somebody, there'll be people down here at the front, or just grab somebody that you know and you trust and you want to speak with. But my prayer for us this morning is just that we'll be really honest with ourselves. Because, I pretended for years that everything was fine. And actually, I fooled a lot of people who thought it was fine. But only we can really be honest with ourselves. And God knows anyway. He knows anyway where you are. And he wants you so desperately to come back and to realign him in the center of your lives. So Phil's just going to play for a few minutes. And if you want prayer, come and find one of us. But at the very least, just spend some time thinking about what it is you're prioritizing today. And whether that is Jesus or whether it's something else.